Good afternoon. It's Thursday, March 26th, and getting ready to talk about Chapter 28, Section 1, the New Frontier. I'm going to talk about the 1960 election and move forward from there. Your question of the day is, why did Kennedy have difficulty getting his New Frontier legislation passed? That'll be on the Teams page where you just open it up, type in your answer, and then turn your answer in, and then I'll go through and check them and grade it and return it to you. The election of 1960 brought on some new things and improved on some things. They had televised debates. Now, they had used televised debates before 1960, but the difference was that more and more people watched those televised debates in 1960. And really, the debates had a lot to do with who was going to win the election this time, which was different than any other time. It looked like, if you go back and watch those debates, if you get on YouTube and look up the Kennedy-Nixon debates, you're going to see that Kennedy always seemed relaxed. He looked youthful. He looked healthy. It's speculated that he got some people who are really good in makeup and applied makeup on him that made him look younger, made him look healthy. Compared to Nixon, in one of the debates, Nixon looked really, really bad. He was sweating profusely, looked pale. It really influenced voters' opinions in these debates. And the country had lived through a time of prosperity and was looking for new leadership on a direction to go. We had war hero presidents. Eisenhower had been a war hero president and had took us through part of the Cold War. Well, Kennedy was also a war hero. You can check out his stuff. If you search out PT 109, you'll find out that Kennedy was in World War II, and he was in the Navy, and his PT boat was shot and sank, and him and his men survived on the ocean and made it to an island and lived, obviously. But differences between Kennedy and Nixon. Kennedy was a Catholic from a wealthy, influential family. Nixon was a Quaker who was from California, and his family had struggled financially. Okay, so there were some differences there. I had mentioned yesterday when I asked you to read this that there was some concern with the American people that Kennedy, being Catholic, if he won the election, that the Pope would run the country. And Kennedy ended up having to defend that to the point that he said that whoever wins the election, no matter what religion they are, that the people would still run the country. So it wouldn't be the Pope running the country. This was a new kind of a campaign. There was a lot of stuff on TV, a lot more ads. Kennedy's family the Democrats spent over $6 million in campaign funds, where Nixon's and the Republicans spent $7.5 million. So it was a lot more money spent in the 1960 campaign than there had been in previous election years. The main issues, part of our question yesterday, were the economy and the Cold War. The economy had seen some boom and growth, but we know from looking at Section 4 in Chapter 27 that there was a good part of America that wasn't experiencing this boom. You had your African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, and the poor in the Appalachian area. They weren't experiencing this boom. So the economy was a big issue. And then the Cold War. The Cold War had been an issue since the end of World War II. Things were heating up. Kennedy, coming into being the president, would have to address Cold War issues right off the bat. There were some things going on that was going to cause some problems, okay? So there was also a thing called the missile gap. It was portrayed that the Soviet Union was ahead of us in missiles. And we've mentioned that. I mentioned this before. How many nuclear missiles does it take to get your point across? I mean, once the first one's fired, how many does it take to really destroy the world? And when you start looking at the stockpile of nuclear weapons that had come along for a long time, we had more than enough to destroy the world. We're just thankful that no one ever decided to use one, because if it had, obviously we wouldn't be here, or this world wouldn't be like we know it today. Okay. The other thing that kind of came up, remember we talked about Sputnik and how the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and this really concerned the Americans. They felt that the Soviet Unions were getting ahead in the space race. This could lead to all kinds of stuff. They talked about attacking with nuclear weapons from space, and how would you defend it, and all that. Really, people's imaginations ran wild. Well, Kennedy will address this, and he will push the country to not only catch up with the Soviet Unions, but actually to surge past them when it comes to space and technology. Okay. And I mentioned Kennedy's religion. What he actually said was, he said, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell a president who should be a Catholic how to act. And that's how he addressed it to the people. He assured them that that wouldn't happen. The election went in Kennedy's favor, as we know, but it was probably one of the closest ones in history to date. Kennedy's going to get the popular vote by 118,000 out of 68 million votes cast. The Electoral College, he's going to win by 303 to Nixon's 219. So it was pretty close. There were several states that only a few thousand votes could have swung the election, the Electoral College, another direction. So it wouldn't have taken much, and Nixon could have possibly won. So it wasn't a landslide victory for Kennedy. He just did get it. I mean, it was a pretty good margin, but still, it wasn't like he just walked away with the victory, okay? Now, the next part talks about the Kennedy mystique. John Kennedy, also called JFK by a lot of people, during the campaign, many people had been taken with his youth and optimism. What people didn't really realize behind that he had been injured in the war. And he also had a spinal condition that caused him great pain. And remember, we talked about how Roosevelt, during the Depression, and how he had hidden his ailment from people, how when he took the nomination, cameras didn't show him being helped up to the podium. Remember how he used to hold the podium, and he would put one hand in the air, but he always grabbed the podium. Well, Kennedy wasn't quite that bad, but Kennedy did hide physical ailments from the public. He had some issues with his back, and it caused him some problems, and it got severe. He had severe pain at times, but in public, he put on this role of being healthy and being young and being very active. And not that he wasn't, but he did have these ailments, okay? Kennedy, in his speech for inauguration, it was cold. It was in January, on January 20th. It was a crisp and cold day in Washington, D.C. Everybody was wearing their coats and their hats and stuff. And Kennedy stepped up to the podium, take the oath of office, and deliver his inauguration speech in his suit. No overcoats, no hats, no gloves, no scarves, anything. He just stood there, and he wanted to show that he was young and strong and virile and ready to go to take on everything. In part of his speech, he said the torch has been passed to a new generation, that the old generation is past and we're ready to forge ahead. He also said one of the most famous things in his speech, and if you look up John Kennedy quotes, this is going to be one of the top quotes you're going to see. He says, "My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." And that was a big thing that he pushed, trying to say, let's make this country good. Let's make this country great. Okay. So that was his way to do it. His wife, Jacqueline, and two children, Caroline and John, would move into the White House with him. It had been a long, long time since they'd had a president that brought children into the White House. So it was quite different. He was young. A lot of people used to compare the Kennedy years in the White House, which wasn't very long, as we know, because of his assassination. They called it like Camelot. If any of you know the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, it took place in Camelot. And so that's what they would call the time of Kennedy being in the White House was the time of Camelot. But he worked hard and he tried to make things better. Now, he had some success and some setbacks on the domestic front, and that's why our question asks, why did he have problems getting his New Frontier legislation passed? He called it the New Frontier because he had some things he wanted to do. He hoped to increase aid to education, provide health insurance to the elderly, create a Department of Urban Affairs, and help migrant workers. Those are the four things that he wanted to do. Now, he had some struggles with Congress, and part of the reason was that Congress, he was a Democrat, and the majority in Congress was Republicans. But the other problem was that Kennedy worked so hard on electing himself, he didn't really help any of the other Democratic representatives or senators get elected. And so those that didn't feel they owed him anything and didn't feel that they needed to work specifically on his agendas unless they met up with their agendas. So he really didn't have the political backing in the House or the Senate with his Democratic senators and representatives. So Kennedy had to finally decide to pick his battle. So when some of his legislation did not pass, he moved on to what was more important to him to try to get that passed. Legislatures, Republicans, as well as conservatives and Southern Democrats, didn't view Kennedy as likable as much, and they didn't like his New Frontier program. They thought it was too big and too costly. It was going to be too expensive for everybody to do, okay? In the end, Congress defeated a number of JK's proposals, including health insurance for the elderly, the Department of Urban Affairs, and federal aid to education. Kennedy preferred to reserve his bargaining power to things he thought were more winnable. So he kind of backed off on those things, okay? Now, he did work to strengthen the economy. In an effort to increase growth and create more jobs, Kennedy advocated a New Deal strategy of deficit spending, first implemented during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. He got Congress to invest in more funds in defense and in space exploration. Here we go, space exploration. Now, the reason they agreed to that was because of Sputnik. Plain and simple. That's all it was. The Soviet Union had put a satellite in space, and America thought, hey, we're behind. They're going to get ahead of us, and there's going to be a lot of things they can do that we can't if we don't get caught up. So people were all for putting money into space. So that wasn't going to be a problem. He also sought to boost the economy by increasing business production and efficiency. Now, he did something else that doesn't happen very often, and it was met with mixed reviews. His administration asked businesses to hold down prices and asked labor leaders to hold down pay increases. Now imagine that. A sitting president is going to come out and say, hey, can you hold down your production cost, and turn to labor and say, hey, can you hold down asking for wages? And let's get a balance here and let's increase the economy, because a lot of things that he was pushing for could have caused inflation. So he was trying to get things settled down a little bit so they didn't have that inflation, okay? He got Secretary of Labor Arthur Goldberg, had labor unions in the steel industry agree to reduce their demands for higher wages. But in 1962, several steel companies raised their prices anyhow, okay? The president threatened to have the Department of Defense buy cheaper steel from foreign companies and instructed the Justice Department to investigate whether the steel industry was guilty of price fixing. So mixed results, okay? Some companies and some labor unions agreed, but there always are going to be companies and labor unions who aren't going to agree with what's going on. So that happened during this time. Another way he wanted to get the economy moving, he also adopted a supply side ideas and pushed for a cut in taxes. Now, the cut in taxes are going to be a problem because they're going to be afraid if you cut taxes, it's going to cause inflation. Kennedy's idea was that if we cut business taxes, and that was the primary reason a lot of people didn't like it because they thought businesses were going to benefit from it. But his claim was if we cut business taxes, then they can hire more people. And he used the expression that a rising tide lifts all boats. So you take those taxes down, the money to spend goes up. And so these companies now can hire more people, increase their production. The more people being hired are going to buy more stuff. And so he said it was just a rising tide effect that would happen, okay? Kennedy also convinced Congress to increase the minimum hourly wage to $1.25 an hour. Now think about that. 1960 and 1961, the minimum wage was $1.25 an hour. Now, how many of you could get by working and making $1.25 an hour? Would you even want to go to work? We're talking now about the minimum wage in the next few years increasing to $15 an hour. And we've talked about this in class before, the many reasons why we're trying to raise it, getting this minimum wage up to $15 an hour. But just think about it. In 1960, the minimum wage was $1.25. Now, obviously, houses were cheaper, cars were cheaper, and things like that. So, and gas was pennies on the dollar. Milk was 25, 30 cents a gallon, things like that. So you can see that that $1.25 went a whole lot farther than what it would today. I mean, you can't even buy a gallon of gas for $1.25. So you go work 8 hours a day and then have to go buy $8 gallons worth of gas, and you will spend more than what you made that day. So it's not logical for today, but that's what it was in 1960, $1.25. He also provided more than $400 million in aid to depressed areas under the Area Redevelopment Act. The administration's Housing Act created extensive home buying and slum clearage programs, as well as 1,000 construction jobs. So he's trying to help people where they live, okay? He also worked on women's rights. Now, he didn't have any females directly working for him, but he did have females in positions. Esther Peterson was Assistant Secretary of Labor and Director of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. In 1961, he created a Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which is another way he tried to help. He also, in 1963, signed the Equal Pay Act for women. So there were some things he did to try to help women out in the country. We haven't quite got to the civil rights movement yet. That's going to be coming up. He gets involved in that and makes some drastic things happen. We finished up this section talking about the Warren Court reforms. In 1953, President Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren to be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was a popular governor from California. But then his court took an active stance. They talked about the reapportionment, or the way in which states draw up political districts. They wanted to make it one man, one vote. And let me explain that, because I don't want that to be misunderstood. They had found out that a rural area in a state might have a rural county with only 2,340 voters had one representative in the state assembly, while urban county with 133 times more voters only had 7. The vote of the city dweller counted for much less than the vote of the rural resident. And so this was in Tennessee. So what it was saying is that even though there was 2,000 residents with one representative, there was 133 times more people living in urban areas, and they only had 7. So that's only 7 times more representatives. They didn't have 133 times more representatives, okay? So they had to find a way to reapportion the districts to get a balance. You still went by your population. It still went like the Electoral College works today. You take your votes, and then your votes for your state that goes towards your president goes by the way the vote went in your state. And the reason they do that is because there are some states that have way more people in their state than the next 6 to 7 states have. So that one state could have overrun those 6 or 7 states. But as it is right now, the state has a say in how a president is elected and which president wins. Okay. And that's kind of what they were trying to do here with this one man, one vote. There were some cases that came out because of this. Baker versus Carr, the Supreme Court reached it reached the Supreme Court after a federal court said the issue should be decided by legislation. They started using the 14th Amendment, which specifically gives Congress authority to enforce voting rights. In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts did have jurisdiction and set the matter back to the federal courts. Okay. 2 years later, in 64, Reynolds versus Sims, the current apportionment system in most states was indeed unconstitutional. In that decision, the Warren Court required legislators to reapportion electoral districts so that all citizens' votes would have equal weight. The court's decision was a monstrous one. It shifted the political power throughout the country from rural and often conservative areas to urban, where more liberal voters resided. It boosted the political power of African Americans and Hispanics also who lived in some of those urban areas. So they decided that they had to reapportion states. Now, you'll hear today talk a little bit about the population in Illinois has gone down the last few years. And the speculation is after the census is over here in 2020, that we might lose a representative in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., because that's based on our population. And you have to have one representative for so many people in your population. Well, if it keeps going down and other states' population is going up, then they have to adjust that, and they'll have to take one from Illinois and send it to the next state where the population has gone up enough to warrant another one. And that's a speculation of what might happen today during our census time. Okay, when the census is all over and they run the numbers, there's a possibility we might lose one. We've had here in the past where they've had to refigure districts for representatives in the Illinois House of Representatives, and they've had to move district lines because of it. At one time, Chapin Rose was a representative from this district. Well, when they realigned districts, he got moved to another area and we had to elect someone else. So that happens as population moves and you have to change that. So that's what they were doing in the 1960s under the Warren Court. And the Warren Court said that the way they were doing it was unconstitutional and had to change. And they all had to go back and realign their districts for representation. Okay. Extending due process. In the 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court began to use the 14th Amendment to apply the Bill of Rights to states. Now, originally, the Bill of Rights was set up for the federal government. And then each state had its own Bill of Rights. But what they started realizing in the 1960s was that the Bill of Rights that were set forth by the federal government, all of them didn't always apply in the individual states. There were some states that didn't have all the same rights that the Bill of Rights offered under the federal government. Okay. The 14th Amendment specifically stated that no state shall deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, due process of law means that the law cannot treat individuals unfairly, arbitrarily, or unreasonably, and that the courts must follow proper procedures and rules when trying cases. Now, what this really brought about was something that all of you have probably heard of called the Miranda Rights. And so what they ended up deciding was that people had the right to trial by jury, legal representation. They did not have to speak to the police when being arrested until they had legal representation. And if they chose to speak to the police before legal representation was there, that what they said could be used against them. Okay, so this was part of the due process extending it. What in Espedito versus Illinois, the justices ruled that a suspect must be allowed to access a lawyer and must be informed of his or her rights to remain silent before being questioned by the police. In Miranda versus Arizona, went on further, requiring that authorities immediately give suspects a fourfold warning. The warning consisted of informing the suspects that they have the right to remain silent. Anything they say can be used against them in a court of law, and they have right to have a lawyer while being questioned. And if they cannot afford a lawyer, the court will provide one of them free of charge. And that's what we get. It's called the Miranda Rights now. Okay. So that was extending due process. And prior to this time, we probably didn't have that as much. Okay, so now it's getting a little bit more, and that's what that Warren Court did. The other thing they did was prayer and privacy. They applied the First Amendment to states. In Engel versus Vital, the court decided that states could not compose official prayers and require those prayers to be recited in state public schools. The following year, they ruled that daily Bible readings in public schools couldn't happen. Waiting on another controversial issue, the court ruled that prohibiting the sale and the use of birth control devices violated citizens' rights and their privacy. So this court had a pivotal role in shaping the nation's policies during the 1960s. And that's why we talk about the Warren Court and their reforms, okay? This brings us up to the end of this section. I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll look at JFK and the Cold War. We'll have another question of the day, and then we'll kind of see where we go. I want you to encourage you to contact your classmates if you talk to them, and let them know they need to be checking the Microsoft Team apps, checking their school email. Obviously, we were scheduled at first to probably go back to school on the 31st with the governor's stay-at-home order going into April. Obviously, that's probably not going to happen. We can't very well have a stay-at-home order if all of a sudden they open the schools and we go back. So I would expect we'll be doing this again next week, and who knows how long. That's not really been said yet. I know the State Board of Education and the Illinois Education Association are working with the governor's office, trying to see what the next steps are and what needs to happen next with this shutdown of schools. So talk to your friends, tell your friends that they need to be going in Teams app, getting the question of the day, looking for assignments, checking out these videos. It's about the only way we're going to be able to discuss stuff, and we'll see what happens in the next few days, okay? You guys be safe. Follow the guidelines that have been set out, and hopefully we'll get to see you soon. Have a good evening. Bye.